Welcome back to the Scary Collector. I want you to do something before we begin. Close the curtains. Lock your door. And if you're in a room by yourself right now, maybe stay that way, because what I'm about to share with you tonight is not fiction. These are not stories written by a screenwriter hoping to thrill you. These are not urban legends passed down through campfire whispers. These are real. Every single one of them. What you are about to hear tonight are 10 of the most disturbing, terrifying, and deeply unsettling true horror stories ever documented. Pulled from police reports, court records, survivor testimonies, psychiatric evaluations, and news archives spanning decades, some of these cases remain unsolved. Some of the people responsible are still walking free. And some of the places where these events occurred still exist today exactly as they were. Tonight we go through all 10. No rushing. No skipping the details. Because the details are exactly what make these stories so deeply, profoundly horrifying. So settle in. This is going to be a long night. The year was 1981. The small mountain resort town of Keddie, California sat nestled in a canyon in Plumas County, deep in the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was the kind of place that felt like it was outside of time. A cluster of cabins surrounded by pine trees, with a creek running nearby and the smell of wood smoke always in the air. Families vacationed there. Hikers passed through. Felt safe. Felt like the kind of place where nothing bad could happen. Glenna Sue Sharp was a 36-year-old mother of 5 children. She had recently separated from her husband and moved into Cabin 28 at the Keddie Resort, trying to build a fresh start for herself and her kids. She was, by all accounts from neighbors and friends, a warm and loving woman who put her children first in everything she did. On the evening of April 11, 1981, Sue had a few of her children home with her in Cabin 28. 14-year-old Johnny, 12-year-old Tina, and 5-year-old Greg were there. Johnny's friend Dana Wingate, also 14, was spending the night. And Sue's neighbor Sheila, who was just 12 years old at the time, was also visiting. The next morning, on April 12th, Sheila walked to the neighboring cabin to find her parents. She did not want to wake anyone in Cabin 28. She assumed everyone was still asleep. She had no idea what she was leaving behind. When neighbors later went to check on Cabin 28, what they found inside defied comprehension. Sue Sharp and Johnny Sharp and Dana Wingate had been murdered with a brutality that left investigators shaken for years afterward. All 3 had been bound with tape and medical tubing. All 3 had been beaten with a hammer and a claw hammer. And all 3 had been stabbed repeatedly with a large knife. Possibly a hunting knife. The violence was extreme. The coroner's report described the scene in clinical terms that nonetheless conveyed the absolute savagery of what had occurred. 3 children, Tina, Greg, and a younger sibling, were found in the cabin, alive. The smaller children had slept through the attack, or had been spared deliberately. They were physically unharmed. But 12-year-old Tina was missing. Tina Sharp was gone. No sign of her. No blood trail outside the cabin. No witnesses who had seen her leave. Just gone. The investigation that followed was one of the most troubled in California law enforcement history. Local authorities were overwhelmed. Evidence was mishandled. Cabins surrounding the crime scene were not adequately searched. Witnesses were interviewed inconsistently, despite multiple persons of interest being identified over the years. Some of them with violent criminal histories who had been in the area that night. No one was ever charged with the murders. The case went cold. And then, 3 years later, in 1984, a partial human skull was discovered in Feather Falls, California, approximately 30 miles from Keddie. Dental records confirmed what everyone had feared. It was Tina Sharp. She had been killed and her remains had been transported and left in the wilderness. What happened to her in those final hours remains one of the most heartbreaking unsolved questions in American true crime history. Cabin 28 still stood at the Keddie Resort for decades after the murders. People photographed it. Some tried to visit it at night. The windows were boarded. The door was nailed shut. Former residents of Keddie said that in the years following the murders, the cabin always felt wrong, like something had been left there that didn't belong in the world of the living. In 2004, the cabin was finally demolished, but the Keddie murders remain unsolved. Sue Sharp, Johnny Sharp, Dana Wingate, and little Tina, who never made it home. No one has ever answered for what happened in Cabin 28 on the night of April 11, 1981. This next story is one that has haunted criminologists, historians, and investigators for over 100 years. And what makes it uniquely terrifying, more than the violence itself, is one small, almost inconceivable detail buried in the evidence. The killer did not flee. The year was 1922. The place was a remote farmstead called Hinterkaifeck, located in rural Bavaria, Germany, about an hour's drive north of Munich. The farm was home to a family. Andreas Gruber, 63, his wife Casilia, 72, their widowed daughter Victoria, 35, Victoria's children, 7-year-old Casilia and 2-year-old Joseph, and the farm's maid, a young woman named Maria Baumgartner, who had only just started working at the farm the very day she was killed. The Gruber family had a reputation in the area for being reclusive. Andreas was regarded as difficult, even hostile. But nothing about the family suggested what was coming. In the days before the murders, Andreas Gruber told neighbors and acquaintances about strange things happening at the farm. He had found unfamiliar footprints in the snow, tracks that led from the edge of the forest to the farmhouse, but never led back out again. He had heard footsteps in the attic at night, moving above the bedroom where he slept. He found a newspaper left on the property that no one in the family had purchased. The previous maid had left the farm months earlier, citing her unwillingness to stay at a place that felt deeply wrong to her. Neighbors thought Andreas was being paranoid. Some dismissed his concerns outright. He was not paranoid. On the weekend of March 31st to April 1st, 1922, the entire household was murdered. Andreas, his wife Casilia, Victoria, little Casilia, and the new maid Maria were all killed with a mattock, a heavy farming tool like a pickaxe with devastating force. 2-year-old Joseph was killed in his crib. No one came to check on the farm for 4 days. In rural Bavaria at the time, that was not unusual. Farms were often self-contained. People didn't visit unless invited. But after 4 days, neighbors and a postman noticed that the farm seemed strangely still. No smoke from the chimney. No movement. No animals being tended to. When people finally entered the farmstead, they found the bodies. And then they found something else. The animals had been fed. The cow had been milked. The chickens had been given grain. Someone had prepared food in the kitchen. The fire had been kept lit. Whoever murdered the Gruber family had stayed on the farm for days afterward, living there, eating the food, tending the animals. Among the bodies of the people they had just slaughtered, police and investigators were baffled. The sheer nerve of it, the calm, the deliberateness of someone who killed 6 people, including a toddler, and then simply remained, going about a domestic routine in a farmhouse full of corpses. Over 100 suspects were investigated. The crime was re-examined in the 1980s using modern forensic techniques. Criminologists and historians have theorized for decades about who could have done this and why. No one was ever charged. No one was ever definitively identified. The person who stayed at Hinterkaifeck after those murders, sleeping there, cooking there, tending the animals there, walked away and vanished into history, The farmstead itself was eventually torn down. The building materials were burned, reportedly out of fear and revulsion by those who had to handle them. But those footprints in the snow, coming out of the forest and never leaving, remain one of the most chilling details in the history of true crime. Because they tell you something the police always knew but could never prove. He had already been there for days before he killed them. He was living in that attic, watching, waiting, and nobody knew. Some true horror stories do not take place in a single night of violence. Some unfold across years, grinding, sustained, methodical, carried out not in isolated fury but in cold, calculated control. This is one of those stories. It is the story of Colleen Stan and what was done to her over the course of 7 years. In May of 1977, Colleen Stan was a 20-year-old woman living in Eugene, Oregon. She was hitchhiking to a friend's birthday party in Northern California. A common enough practice in the late 1970s, when hitchhiking carried a fraction of the stigma it carries today. She was offered a ride by a young couple, Cameron and Janice Hooker, who had an infant daughter in the car with them. They seemed safe. A young family. Colleen accepted. The drive began normally. They chatted. They stopped at a gas station. Colleen felt no alarm. And then, somewhere on the highway, Cameron Hooker told Colleen to put on a specially constructed wooden box. Built to fit around the human head like a helmet, designed to disorient the wearer, to block light and sound and make it impossible to tell what direction they were traveling. Colleen put it on. She had no idea that decision would define the next 7 years of her life. Cameron Hooker was not a random predator. He had spent years planning what he intended to do. He had constructed a wooden box. Not the head box, but a larger one, roughly the size of a large chest freezer, and had placed it beneath the waterbed in the master bedroom of his home in Red Bluff, California. When they arrived, Colleen was imprisoned in that box. She lived in that box for up to 23 hours a day. What followed was a textbook case of what psychologists now call coercive control, though at the time it had no official clinical name. Hooker subjected Colleen to prolonged isolation, sleep deprivation, physical punishment, and psychological manipulation. He convinced her that she was part of a fictional organization called The Company, a group he claimed monitored slaves across the country and would kill her family if she disobeyed or tried to escape. He made her sign a document called a slave contract. Over time, through mechanisms that psychologists have since described as deeply consistent with cult indoctrination and trauma bonding, Colleen's perception of reality shifted. She was permitted eventually to have a job, to jog outside, to write letters to her family. Censored by Cameron, of course, she had opportunities to run. She did not run. Not because she was stupid, not because she was weak, but because Cameron Hooker had systematically dismantled her ability to believe that running was possible or safe or real. In 1984, 7 years after her abduction, Janice Hooker, Cameron's wife, who had participated in Colleen's captivity, told Colleen the truth. The company did not exist. It had never existed. It was a fiction designed entirely to control her. Colleen left. She walked out the door and left. And then, in one of the most heartbreaking dimensions of this story, she did not immediately go to the police. Her trauma was so complete, her trust in her own judgment so shattered, that it took several more years before she came forward. Cameron Hooker was eventually tried and convicted in 1984 on multiple counts, including kidnapping and rape. He was sentenced to 104 years in prison. Colleen Stan survived. She rebuilt her life. She has spoken publicly about her experience. Her resilience is extraordinary. But the story of what Cameron Hooker constructed beneath his waterbed, that box, those years of darkness, serves as a reminder of something deeply uncomfortable, that evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it pulls over on a highway in a family car. Sometimes it smiles at you, and sometimes it asks you to put something on your head. There are places in the world where something happened that the land itself seems unable to forget, where the air in a room feels wrong, where silence isn't restful but oppressive, where, no matter how much time passes, something seems to linger. The Moore House in Villisca, Iowa is one of those places. The town of Villisca in 1912 was a small, quiet, thoroughly unremarkable farming community in Montgomery County, Iowa. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where doors were left unlocked, and where the idea of something truly terrible happening felt not just unlikely but impossible. Josiah Moore was a successful businessman. His wife Sarah was 39. They had 4 children: Herman, 11, Mary Catherine, 10, Arthur, 7, and Paul, 5. On the night of June 9, 1912, 2 additional children were staying at the house. Lena Stillinger, 12, and Ina Stillinger, 8. 8 people were in that house. By morning, all 8 were dead. Every person in the Moore house that night had been murdered with an axe in their sleep. The precision of it was disturbing. No one had been able to escape. No one had made it to a door or a window. The killer had moved through the house systematically, from room to room. Josiah and Sarah Moore were in the master bedroom. The 4 Moore children in their rooms. The 2 Stillinger girls in the guest room. 8 victims, all killed in the dark. While sleeping, the axe was found in the Stillinger girls' room, cleaned and laid on the floor. When investigators processed the scene, they found something that added another layer of dread. All the mirrors in the house had been covered with clothing. Curtains had been pulled shut and, in some cases, clothing pressed against the gaps. A slab of bacon had been taken from the icebox and placed in the room with the Stillinger girls. Its purpose unknown. Somebody had spent time in that house. They had arranged things. They had, in some impossible, incomprehensible way, made themselves at home. The investigation was an absolute disaster. The crime scene was not preserved. Hundreds of townspeople walked through the house in the hours after the bodies were discovered. Out of shock, out of morbid curiosity, out of the sheer disbelief that this could have happened in Villisca. Evidence was contaminated beyond recovery. Over the years, multiple suspects were identified. A traveling minister named George Kelly confessed to the murders, then recanted, then confessed again. He was tried twice. The first trial ended in a hung jury, the second in acquittal. A known serial killer who traveled through the Midwest during that period was also considered, and modern investigators have noted striking similarities between the Villisca murders and a string of axe murders across the Midwest from 1911 to 1912. The Villisca murders were never officially solved. The house still stands today. It has been preserved as a historical site and is open for tours. People sleep there overnight. Paranormal investigators, thrill seekers, people who want to say they spent the night in one of America's most famously haunted locations. In 2014, a man named Robert Stephen Larson Jr. stabbed himself inside the house during an overnight stay, later claiming he had become overwhelmed by a supernatural presence. He survived. Whether the house is haunted in any literal sense is a matter of personal belief. But something about the Villisca Axe Murders refuses to stay in the past. The sheer scale of it, 8 people, all sleeping, all killed in darkness, by someone who has never been identified, creates a wound in history that never quite closes. 8 people went to sleep in Villisca, Iowa, in June of 1912. None of them woke up, and the person responsible walked out into the night and was never brought to justice. Not every true horror story involves a killer. Some involve something harder to categorize. Something that sits outside the comfortable boundaries of what we think we know about the world. This is one of those stories. And whatever you believe about what lies beyond the rational, I want you to simply listen. Located in the Xochimilco Canal south of Mexico City, there is an island that has no official name on any map, but which locals and visitors know as La Isla de las Muñecas, the Island of the Dolls. To visit it, you travel by Trajinera, the colorful flat-bottomed boats that navigate the ancient canal system that dates back to the Aztec civilization. The canals are beautiful during the day. Willow trees drag their branches in the water. Herons stand motionless in the shallows. You can buy food and flowers from vendors who pole their boats alongside yours. But then, around a bend in the canal, the island appears, and every tree on the island is hung with dolls. Hundreds of them, possibly thousands. Dolls of every type. Plastic baby dolls, cloth dolls, toy figures, porcelain heads, limbs without bodies, faces without eyes. They hang from the branches and the fence posts and the wire strung between the trees. Many of them are weathered and decayed. Some have lost their eyes. Some have lost their limbs. Some are so old and deteriorated that they are barely recognizable as dolls at all. And in the wind, they move. The man responsible for covering this island in dolls was a man named Julian Santana Barrera. He was a reclusive individual who, in the 1950s, retreated to this small island in the canals and lived there alone for decades as a caretaker. Shortly after moving there, Julian claimed to have found the body of a young girl floating in the canal near the island, a child who had drowned. Julian said he was unable to save her. Shortly after her death, Julian said her spirit began to haunt him. He began finding a doll floating in the water near where the girl had drowned. He hung the doll from a tree, believing it would placate her spirit, would give her something to inhabit, something to hold on to. But the haunting did not stop. Over the following 50 years, Julian collected every doll he could find, trading vegetables he grew on the island, salvaging from the canals, accepting donations from visitors who had heard about his island. He hung every single one of them in the trees, on the fences, on every available surface. He told visitors that the dolls were not decorations. They were not art. They were protection. They were offerings. He told people that at night the dolls moved, that he could hear them whispering to each other, that on certain nights, the girl's spirit moved through the island and passed from doll to doll like wind through grass. People dismissed him as eccentric, perhaps delusional. A lonely old man living in a swamp, surrounded by rotting toys, frightened of his own imagination. In 2001, Julian Santana Barrera was found dead in the canal, drowned, in the exact same spot where he claimed to have found the little girl's body 50 years earlier. He was discovered by his nephew. The island has remained largely as he left it. The dolls remain in the trees. They continue to decay. Visitors from around the world travel the canals to see them. Many visitors report feeling uneasy on the island, a persistent sense of being watched. Some report hearing sounds that have no obvious source. Photographers have captured images that, upon later review, seem to contain things that weren't visible to the naked eye at the time. Whether any of that is supernatural or psychological or simply the product of an island covered in hundreds of decaying human faces staring at you from every direction, that is for each visitor to decide. But Julian Santana Barrera drowned, in the same spot where he said the girl drowned, and to this day, no one can fully explain either death. Some horror stories are not about one victim. Some are about an entire country held captive by a single, anonymous, seemingly untouchable individual. In Japan, there is a man known only by a nickname, the monster with 21 faces. He has never been identified. He has never been caught. And what he did between 1984 and 1985 shook Japan to its foundations. In March of 1984, a man named Katsuhisa Izaki, the president of Izaki Glico, one of Japan's largest confectionery companies, famous for products like Pocky, was kidnapped from his home in the middle of the night. Armed men broke into his house, restrained his family, and abducted him. He was held for 3 days before managing to escape. The ransom demand had been for 1 billion yen and 100 kilograms of gold. The police had no leads, no identifications, no arrests, and then things got stranger. Shortly after Izaki's release, the kidnappers sent letters to newspapers and police. They were signed with the name, The Monster with 21 Faces, a reference to a fictional villain from a popular Japanese detective novel series. The letters were taunting. They were articulate. They were confident. And then the monster did something that had never happened before in Japan. He poisoned food on store shelves. Packages of Glico candy were laced with potassium cyanide and placed back on supermarket shelves. The monster then sent letters warning the public and warning the manufacturers that the poison products were out there. Millions of packages of candy had to be pulled from stores across the country. Glico's stock collapsed. The company lost billions. But the monster was not finished. Over the following months, he expanded his targets. Other major Japanese food companies, Marudai Ham, Morinaga and Company, House Foods, received extortion demands and threats. Some received packages containing actual cyanide-laced products. Over 21 confectionery companies were targeted, and the monster always seemed to be one step ahead of the police. There were sightings. In one of the most famous cases, a police officer spotted a suspicious man near one of the drop points and gave chase on a motorcycle. The man fled. Witness descriptions were taken. A composite sketch was created. A man with unusual facial features, distinctive in appearance. He was never found. The police investigation became one of the largest in Japanese history. Thousands of officers were assigned to the case. Surveillance operations were mounted. Informants were cultivated. Nothing worked. In August of 1985, after more than a year of terror, the monster with 21 faces sent one final letter. In it, he declared that his campaign was over, not because he had been caught, not because he had been pressured, but because he was bored. He retired from his crimes. He signed off by saying that it was boring to continue. The letter was followed by silence. The statute of limitations on the crimes expired in 2000. During the investigation, the superintendent of the Shiga Prefectural Police, a man named Yamamoto, took responsibility for the failure of his department to catch the monster and died by suicide. He is considered, by some, to be the case's final victim. To this day, the identity of the monster with 21 faces is unknown. He may still be alive. He may have died quietly somewhere, his secret intact. He may be elderly now, living an ordinary life, knowing that he terrorized a nation, poisoned food that millions of people touched, drove a senior police official to his death, and was never ever brought to justice. The monster with 21 faces. He told you he had 21 faces. You never saw a single one of them. There is a particular horror in the realization that a killer was operating in plain sight for years, and that the systems meant to protect people simply failed, not dramatically, not through corruption or incompetence, necessarily. Sometimes they fail because of indifference, because of who the victims are, because of who society has decided is worth looking for. This is a story about 11 women, and the man, still unidentified, who took them. Albuquerque, New Mexico, February 2009. A woman was walking her dog on a mesa on the outskirts of the city, an area of scrubland and desert on the west side, used by dirt bikers and hikers. Her dog began digging in the sandy soil and unearthed something, a human bone. When investigators arrived and began carefully excavating the area, they found not one body, but many, buried in shallow graves across a stretch of the West Mesa. The remains of 11 women were discovered over the following weeks and months. The remains were so decomposed that it took extensive forensic work to identify them. All were women. Most were young, the youngest was 15 years old. Several were mothers. Several had families who had reported them missing and heard almost nothing back from authorities. Most of them were involved in the sex trade. And this right here is where this story reveals its deepest wound. Some of the families of these women had reported them missing years before the discovery. Some had been told explicitly or implicitly that runaways and sex workers were lower priority. Some had tried repeatedly to get law enforcement to investigate and had been met with bureaucratic walls. The women on the West Mesa had been disappearing for years, one by one. And because of who they were, because of how they lived, because of the stigma attached to their lives, the disappearances had not been connected, had not been urgently investigated, had not been treated as what they were, a serial killer, operating freely. For years, investigators identified a person of interest, a man named Lorenzo Montoya, a convicted sex offender who lived near the West Mesa. In December 2006, years before the bones were discovered, Montoya had been killed by the boyfriend of a woman he had allegedly attacked in his home. When investigators searched Montoya's property following the discovery of the West Mesa remains, they found evidence connecting him to the crimes, but Montoya was dead. He could never be charged, never tried, never convicted. He could never answer for what he did. Families of the victims could never face him in a courtroom, and because he was dead, the case could never be definitively closed. The West Mesa Bone Collector case is not just a horror story about a killer. It is a horror story about a system that allowed him to continue for so long because the people he chose to target were people that system deemed expendable. 11 women, 11 lives, 11 sets of families who waited for answers that never came. Their names deserve to be spoken. Cinnamon Elks, Veronica Romero, Evelyn Salazar, Jeanette Williams, Victoria Chavez, Michelle Valdez, Jamie Barella, Julie Nieto, Silnia Apodaca, Doreen Marquez, and a young woman whose name the investigators listed only as Jane Doe. Because even in death, she could not be identified. 10 names and one woman who never got one. They all deserved better. Every single one of them. Imagine a city so frightened of a single individual that citizens stop leaving their homes after dark. Gun sales skyrocket. People sleep in shifts so someone is always awake. Churches hold prayers for the community's safety. The National Guard is requested. Now imagine that this individual is never caught, never identified, never stopped. That is what happened in Texarkana in 1946. Texarkana is a city that straddles the state line between Texas and Arkansas. Its name is literally a portmanteau of Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana, acknowledging the tri-state region it sits in. In 1946, it was a mid-sized American city going about the business of post-World War II life. Veterans were coming home. People were rebuilding. There was a sense of optimism in the air. And then the Phantom Killer arrived. The attacks began on February 22, 1946. A young couple, Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry, were parked on a lover's lane outside the city when a man approached their car. He was wearing a white cloth mask over his face, homemade with holes cut out for the eyes and mouth. He was holding a gun. He attacked them both, brutally, with his hands and the gun. Jimmy Hollis suffered a fractured skull. Mary Jean Larry suffered injuries that were described in court documents in terms that make clear the attack was sexual as well as physical in nature. Both survived. They were able to describe the attacker. A tall white man, powerfully built, wearing the white mask, The police investigated. No arrests were made. A month later, on March 24th, the Phantom struck again. This time, he did not leave survivors. Richard Griffin, 29, and Polly and Moore, 17, were found shot dead in their parked car. Both had been shot in the back of the head. Polly and Moore had also been assaulted. The town began to grow nervous. But 2 attacks could still be written off as terrible coincidence. Then came April 14th. Paul Martin, 17, and Betty Jo Booker, 15, were coming home from a dance. They were found miles apart. Paul in his car on a rural road, Betty Jo in a field. Both had been shot. Paul was shot multiple times. Betty Jo was also shot multiple times, and her saxophone, she had been performing with a band that evening, was found near her body. 2 teenagers, shot dead, their bodies separated by miles, suggesting the killer had moved them or had found them at different points as they were trying to escape. The town of Texarkana descended into something close to mass panic. Businesses closed early. Movie theaters emptied before sundown. Families boarded up their windows. Some moved temporarily to other cities. A journalist wrote that Texarkana had become a city of the living dead after dark. Gun shops sold out of ammunition. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts and door chains. The Texas Rangers were brought in. The FBI was brought in. Investigators from multiple states descended on Texarkana, and still the Phantom struck again. On May 3rd, Virgil Starks was shot through the window of his home while sitting in his chair reading the newspaper. His wife Katie was also shot when she rushed to help him. Virgil Starks died. Katie Starks survived, fleeing to a neighbor's house, leaving bloody handprints on the walls as she went. And then, nothing, the attacks stopped. As suddenly and inexplicably as they had begun, the Phantom Killer went silent. Whether he was killed, imprisoned for unrelated crimes, or simply moved on has never been established. A man named Yowell Swinney was investigated extensively and considered a strong suspect. His wife told investigators he had confessed to the murders, but she later recanted, and without her testimony there was not enough evidence to charge him. Swinney was eventually imprisoned on unrelated theft charges and died in 1994. He never confessed. The Phantom Killer of Texarkana killed at least 5 people and injured 3 others across a 10-week period in 1946. He wore a mask. He had a method. He had control. And he was never identified. He has been dead for decades, almost certainly. But in Texarkana, there are still people alive who remember what it was like to live in a city too afraid to turn out its lights. Most of the stories I tell on this channel involve individual killers, specific victims, defined crimes. But sometimes the most disturbing true horror stories are institutional, systemic, carried out not by one person but by an entire apparatus of human beings, organized, funded, officially sanctioned. This is one of those stories, and I want to warn you, what I'm about to describe is not comfortable to hear. It is among the most documented and verified atrocities of the 20th century. And the reason it is included in this collection is not to sensationalize. It is because what happened deserves to be remembered, and because the way it ended represents a moral horror as disturbing as the crimes themselves. In 1937, the Imperial Japanese Army established a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit in occupied Manchuria, China. It was called Unit 731, and it operated under the command of Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii. Unit 731 was housed in a massive complex near the city of Harbin. It employed hundreds of scientists, doctors, and military personnel. It had laboratories, surgical theaters, animal holding areas, and a prisoner facility that held, at any given time, hundreds of people. Those prisoners, referred to internally by the clinical term Maryuta, meaning logs, were primarily Chinese, Korean, and Russian civilians, as well as prisoners of war. They were used as experimental subjects. The experiments conducted at Unit 731 are among the most horrifying things human beings have ever done to other human beings. Subjects were deliberately infected with plague, cholera, typhoid, and anthrax to study the progression of these diseases in living bodies. Vivisections were performed, surgeries conducted on living, conscious human beings without anesthesia, purely to study the organs in their living state, because researchers believed anesthetics would compromise their data. Limbs were amputated and reattached to opposite sides of the body. Subjects were placed in pressure chambers and subjected to extremes of atmospheric pressure until their eyes hemorrhaged. They were frozen alive to study the limits of human cold resistance. They were injected with horse blood, seawater, and various pathogens. They were exposed to lethal doses of X-ray radiation. There were weapon tests. Human beings were tied to stakes in open fields while biological weapons were detonated nearby, to study the effectiveness of the weaponry on living targets. Estimates of the death toll from Unit 731's experiments range from 3,000 to as many as 12,000 people. All of these deaths were deliberate. All were documented. The researchers kept meticulous records. When the Soviet Union declared war on Japan in August 1945 and began advancing on Manchuria, Unit 731 was shut down. Prisoners who remained alive were killed to prevent witnesses from surviving. The complex was destroyed as thoroughly as possible. Documents were burned, and then Shiro Ishii and the leading researchers of Unit 731 made a deal. They approached American military intelligence and offered something: all of the data collected during the experiments. Every measurement, every observation, every result from years of human experimentation. Data that the American military acknowledged could not have been obtained any other way. In exchange, they asked for immunity from war crimes prosecution. The United States government accepted the deal. While Nazi scientists involved in similar experiments were tried and executed at Nuremberg, the scientists of Unit 731 walked free. They returned to civilian life in Japan. Several went on to distinguished careers in medicine, academia, and the pharmaceutical industry. Some received government honors. None of them were ever tried. The data from Unit 731 went to the United States military and was classified for years. The survivors, and there were very few, came forward and told their stories. Chinese and Korean governments have sought accountability for decades. Japan's acknowledgement of Unit 731 has been incomplete and contested at various points in its post-war history. Shiro Ishii died of throat cancer in 1959. At home, surrounded by family, he died a free man. The horror of Unit 731 is not just in what was done. It is in who was never made to answer for it, and in the cold, transactional calculation that decided those thousands of lives were worth a filing cabinet of experimental data. We come now to our final story. And this one is different from the others. There is no confirmed death here, no mass casualty, no war crime. And yet this story has disturbed more people, burrowed more deeply under more people's skin, than almost any other true story I have ever covered. Because this story is about a house, and the person who watched it. In June of 2014, Derek and Maria Broadus purchased their dream home in Westfield, New Jersey. A beautiful 6-bedroom house on Boulevard, built in the 1900s, in a quiet and affluent neighborhood. They had 3 young children. They were excited. They were happy. They paid $1.3 million for the house. They never moved in. Within days of taking ownership of the house, the Broaduses received a letter in the mail. It was addressed to the owners of 657 Boulevard. The return address was simply The Watcher. The letter was not a threat, exactly. It was something more unsettling than a threat. It was almost reverential. The writer explained that their family had watched the house for decades, that their grandfather had watched the house, that their father had watched the house, that now they watched it. The letter described the house as their target, a word the writer used intentionally. It asked about the Broaddus's children. It asked how many young ones they would bring to the house, because the house wanted young blood, the writer said. Young blood. It asked if they had found what was in the walls yet. It asked if they had found what was in the basement. It said that the house had been waiting for the right family. And it signed off by saying simply that the watching had already begun. Derek and Maria Broaddus went to the police immediately. An investigation was launched. The letter was forensically analyzed. And then a second letter arrived. The second letter was angrier. It expressed frustration that the house remained empty, that the Broadduses had not yet moved their children in. It asked why they were hesitating. It said that the house needed to have young ones come to live within it, demanded it even. It referenced a local family by name. The Woods family, the previous owners of the house, had apparently also received a letter from the watcher before they sold the property. That letter had warned the Woods family to gather the young ones and bring them to the house. The Woods family, it later emerged, had received that letter shortly before listing the house for sale. They had disclosed it to no one. A third letter arrived. This one acknowledged the police investigation. It taunted the investigators. It said that the watchers were many, that many eyes were on the house. It said that it had been forced to move and observe in ways it had not anticipated, but that the watching continued. The watching always continues. The Broadduses never moved in. They attempted to sell the house and were unable to. No buyer wanted it once the story became public. They attempted to demolish it and build 2 smaller houses on the lot. The local government denied the permits after neighborhood opposition. They attempted to convert it into a rental. Neighbors objected. The legal and financial fallout from the watcher letters destroyed much of the financial stability the Broadduses had built. They sued the previous owners, the Woods family, for failing to disclose the letter they had received. They sued the neighborhood. The cases dragged through courts for years. Meanwhile, investigators tried to identify the watcher. Handwriting analysis was performed. A neighbor was investigated extensively. A reclusive man with unusual behavior, but nothing conclusive was ever established. In 2022, a suspect was publicly named. A man named John Graff, who had lived near the property, whose handwriting was said to resemble that in the letters. But Graff was never charged. He maintained his innocence. The watcher has never been conclusively identified. The letters have never been definitively attributed to any single person. The house on Boulevard still stands. It was eventually sold. Whoever lives there now lives under the weight of those letters, under the knowledge that somewhere, at some point, a person sat down and described their grandparents watching, their parents watching, themselves watching, waiting for the young ones. What makes the watcher story so enduringly disturbing is how it weaponizes the most fundamental human desire. A home. A safe place. A place where your children sleep and your family lives and you can close the door and feel that the world is locked outside. The watcher reached into that feeling and poisoned it. Made a house, this specific house, their house, the house they saved for and dreamed of, into something that watched them, that wanted them, that had always been waiting, and then vanished without consequence. The watching continues. 10 stories, 10 true, documented, verified horrors that happened in the real world, to real people, in houses and farmsteads and canals and cities and cars on dark roads. Some of those responsible were caught. Some confessed. Some made deals and walked free. Some are buried anonymously in history. And some, perhaps the most disturbing category of all, are still out there, living ordinary lives, going to the grocery store, watching television, Growing old, the world does not always deliver justice. The darkness does not always get dragged into the light. Sometimes it simply recedes, retreats, pulls back into the shadows, and waits. But here on The Scary Collector, we do not let these stories disappear. We say the names of the victims. We speak the details that deserve to be spoken. We sit with the discomfort of what human beings are capable of, because to look away is to forget, and to forget is to allow the darkness to count on not being watched. So we keep the light on, and we keep watching back. I'm your host, and this has been The Scary Collector. If these stories found you tonight, if they made you feel something, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share this with someone who needs to hear that the world is strange and dark and worth paying attention to. I'll see you next time. Stay safe, stay aware, and whatever you do tonight, don't ignore the footprints in the snow.